I'm Andrea Hines, one of the two certified food scientists working at the Georgia Tech Manufacturing Extension Partnership. And today we're going to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart as someone who spent many years developing food products: shelf life and how you determine your product shelf life. So shelf life is something we are asked about frequently, especially by those small companies. And this webinar is really intended for those smaller suppliers. Both Wendy and myself have spent many years in the food industry, and some companies spend tens of thousands of dollars on shelf life every year, sometimes necessarily, sometimes not. So we're going to talk a little bit today about food dating basics and how you can determine the shelf life of your product and how that shelf life impacts your product coding. So in the food landscape, there are two types of dates, and the industry terms are open codes or closed codes. So open dates are the dates consumers are used to reading, and those include your best by, sell by, use by, user freeze by, best before, for peak quality, use within, after opening, consume within X number of days. All of that is an open code date. And the purpose of an open code date is to give consumers guidance on how they use your product or when they should use your product by. Closed dates or closed coded dates sometimes are not human readable. Sometimes it's a series of numbers and codes, and that indicates more so the date the product was made. So manufactured on, packed on, made on. And the purpose of closed code dates is to identify production lots really for traceability purposes. And many products have both open and closed dates on the same package. So they may have a best by date and then also a manufactured date, or a packed on date and a user freeze by date. All of that is perfectly acceptable because when it comes to dating of product in general, not many foods are required to have any kind of dating by law. Infant formula is one that does. And if your food is required to be traceable in the event of a recall or withdrawal, then you also are required to have some sort of closed coding or lot coding around that. So infant formula, I do just want to call out, is one of the exceptions when it comes to shelf life. Infant formula is required by law to have a shelf life, and that shelf life must be fully validated. So if you don't have microbiologists and food scientists on staff and a lab in your facility, most infant formula producing companies would use an outside laboratory in order to determine their shelf life. And infant formula is one of the few products that you really should not use past the best by date. The best by date is there for food safety reasons. And I specifically call out using an ISO 17025 accredited laboratory. And the reason for that is laboratories with that type of accreditation have to follow specific validated test methods. And they have to follow specific training and quality metrics within their lab to ensure you get good results. Most major food testing companies have an ISO 17025 accreditation. So if you're using a lab that doesn't, I would have a lot of questions about how they manage food safety or how they manage the quality of the testing internally. But most major food labs in Georgia do carry that 17025 accreditation. When it comes to other foods, shelf life usually is an indication of quality, not food safety. That gives companies a lot of wiggle room to determine their own shelf life. And sometimes I'm asked, what are the biggest impacts of shelf life? It's packaging and storage conditions. So if your product is not meeting your desired shelf life, you might want to look at your packaging first to say, do I have this packaged in the right type of container to achieve the result I want? Sometimes you want your product to be breathable and be exposed to oxygen. Sometimes you want your product to not be exposed to oxygen to prevent oxidative rancidity. All of that is driven by the packaging type. And when establishing shelf life, you need to consider consumer abuse. How long is the product sitting in a hot car or a warehouse that isn't climate controlled? Is the product stored in a convenience store in front of big glass windows, which can shorten the shelf life of the product? All of these factors are important to determine the shelf life of food. For any company, large or small, you need to have some type of documented shelf life study in order to validate what you're doing. But not all shelf life studies have to be performed by an ISO 17025 accredited laboratory. Sometimes the manufacturer can do their own shelf life study, and I'll talk about that later in this presentation. Sometimes a raw material vendor, especially packaging suppliers, might be able to help you with your shelf life determination. Certain types of packaging, especially bottles and cans, certain types of film, are designed to hit a shelf life for common products. So, for example, if you're packaging juice, a 100% juice product, your packaging supplier might have some existing shelf life studies on how their packaging plays with a 100% juice product. There are also university extension services that can assist with shelf life studies if you don't feel comfortable doing it on your own, or if you have the type of food where it's really not a good idea to do on your own. So first, let's talk about the types of products where a supplier might need a little bit of help from the outside to determine shelf life. And these are just recommendations. They are not in any way requirements. If you make a product that is actively fermenting in the final package, my general recommendation is to use a 17025 accredited laboratory to establish your shelf life. Simply because active fermented products are alive, and as they're alive, they're producing gases, and gases under pressure will sometimes make packages explode. So if you're trying to determine the shelf life, you might want that packaging to be in a nice controlled environment like a laboratory, so that if your seal does break, you're not cleaning up a mess. You also might want to use a lab if your product has some unique botulism risks, because botulism is a very deadly foodborne illness. Vacuum packaged foods stored at ambient temperatures or without refrigeration, and low acid canned foods have unique botulism risks that can be impacted by either the way the product is treated in the package, or in the case of low acid canned foods, things like dents in a can. So you might want some assistance from an ISO 17025 laboratory when you're determining the shelf life of those foods. Acid and acidified sauces are also a high risk that some folks don't think about. And not all high acid and acidified sauces are created the same way. But there are some types of acid and acidified sauces that might separate out over time. And if those sauces separate, there could potentially be an environment where microorganisms like botulism might be able to thrive. But they can't thrive if the product is not separated and it's properly emulsified. So if you have some unique risks with your sauces and you're trying to get a very long shelf life on that sauce, you might want to use a third-party lab. But if you have a lab that's not prone to separation, or if it separates out, you primarily have tomato paste and vinegar, that might not be that high of a risk because of the pH of tomato paste and the pH of vinegar. And as always, if you're not quite sure where your food falls on risk, Wendy and I are here to support you and happy to entertain those questions. Now, when it comes to lower risk foods, thinking about things like baked goods, or even raw foods that the consumer prepares, those foods you may be able to determine the shelf life without using a third-party laboratory, or just sending samples to a third-party laboratory for low-cost spoilage and indicator organism testing. Because for most foods, Shelf life is determined by quality. And quality is how a product looks, how a product smells, and how a product tastes and its overall mouthfeel. And if you're the brand owner producing this product, you probably know better than anybody how you want this product to look, smell, and taste. The technical term for evaluating look, smell, and taste is organoleptic analysis. If I'm producing a product and I believe the shelf life on it is 1 month, I might produce 15 to 30 of that product from a single lot. And every day or every other day, I'll take a sample and I'll look at it, I'll smell it, and I'll taste it to make sure it meets my quality expectations. And I'll record my results. I might take pictures. That is a very simplistic form of a shelf life study. So I've given some rough guidelines. Again, none of these are regulations. These are just guidelines on how I would approach collecting samples if I wanted to determine a shelf life study for a low-risk product like an individually packaged chocolate chip cookie. First, determine the shelf life you want your product to achieve or you hope that it will achieve. Then collect samples and hold those samples in a designated location so all the products treated the same way. And you want that location to mimic where the product will be held or sold as much as possible. If you're making a product for food service, it's probably going to be held in the restaurant's pantry, cooler, or freezer. But if you're making a product for retail, is it going to be stored in a retail counter under bright fluorescent lighting? Is it going to be stored back on an ambient shelf where it might have some shadow? Is it going to be stored in a cooler or a freezer? Think about that environment and how you can replicate that in your manufacturing facility. And then you want to collect 3 to 4 samples per test date. And a test date, think of it as a period where you're doing your sampling, you're doing your visual, your tasting. If your shelf life goal is 1 month or less, I would gather enough samples to test the product every day or every other day. If you have a very perishable product and you believe it's only good for 7 days, I would do shelf life testing every day for 7 days. But if your product has a little longer shelf life, maybe 1 month to 6 months, I would do product testing on a weekly basis, not a daily basis. If your shelf life is 6 months or longer, I would test every other week or monthly, at least to start. Once you've established your shelf life, and if you're just doing shelf life monitoring, you might be able to do it less frequently, but these are some general guidelines that I would recommend. So again, as described, each test date, you're going to take your 3 to 4 samples for that day, and I would take a picture and I would file that picture. And I would record my visual observations. Do I believe the color is meeting my expectations, or is it not meeting my expectations? Is it meeting my expectations but darker than I would like, lighter than I would like? Are the colors starting to fade? Are my reds turning to brown? Then I would open one of my samples and I would smell it. Does it smell how I want the consumer to experience the product? And then you want to taste the product. If your product requires preparation prior to consumption, follow your label instructions exactly as they're listed on the package. And then taste the product. What's the overall flavor, the texture, the mouthfeel? Is it meeting your expectation as the brand owner or not? And some products, you might want to see if there are spoilage organisms growing. Those are things like yeast, mold. You also might do indicator organism testing like aerobic plate count, also known as APC, or total plate count, also known as TPC. You could take one of those samples for every test period and send it to a lab for that specific microbial testing. Sending product to a lab for specific microbial testing typically costs less than sending product to a lab for a total shelf life study. And you repeat this testing of your samples, this organoleptic analysis of your samples, until either you've reached your shelf life goal or the product fails or is objectionable. It's no longer meeting your requirements or your expectations. So once you've established your shelf life, you've done your organoleptic analysis, or you've partnered with a lab or a university extension, how does this impact your dating? Does the dating on the product need to match the shelf life? The short answer is no, but it should not exceed the established shelf life. So if the shelf life of your product is 1 year from the production date, you can label it Best By 1 year from the production date. But many companies will do what's called short coding. So they will label, if it's good for a year, if their shelf life testing shows the product is good 1 year from the production date, a company might choose to label it with a Best By date, maybe 9 months from the production day. That's called short coding. And there are several reasons why a company might do that. One of the primary reasons is to factor in product temperature abuse or other factors like fluorescent lighting. And they want to ensure the consumer has the best experience possible. So they'll short code it to ensure the product is meeting maximum freshness, flavor experience for the end user. And that's perfectly okay. This is why you sometimes hear people say shelf life as labeled is a guideline. And occasionally, as a food scientist, I get questions from friends, family, or coworkers saying, hey, I just looked at this thing in my refrigerator and it expired a week ago. Can I still eat it? And my answer is usually, maybe, tell me more. Because products are short-coded. So the Best By date on your refrigerator or in your pantry might not be when the product truly is expired, and you might be able to use that product beyond the expiration date, except for infant formula. If it smells, with the exception of infant formula, if the product smells acceptable, looks acceptable, it's probably okay. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. As always, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership has multiple services here to help you as a manufacturer. And if you have any questions or need to get in touch with Wendy and I, here are our virtual business cards.